What if everything you built, everything you owned, everything you were so proud of, was suddenly laid out in front of you, not as achievement, but as evidence? What if the same intelligence, the same ambition, the same relentless drive that made you powerful, was the very thing used to condemn you? Today's story is about a man who had everything: genius, wealth, influence, power that moved nations. And yet, when the moment of truth arrived, not a courtroom, not a tribunal, not a press conference, but the moment, the one no money can postpone and no lawyer can navigate, he had nothing. Absolutely nothing that mattered. This is a story about choices. About the terrifying distance between who we're capable of being and who we actually choose to be. About gifts wasted, lives destroyed, and the kind of reckoning that finds every single one of us eventually, whether we're ready or not. You're going to hear about hands built to heal that chose to arm. About wars that started in boardrooms long before they started on battlefields. About a man who bought everything, and understood too late that the only thing worth having was the one thing he'd traded away for all the rest. But here's what makes this story different from every cautionary tale you've heard before: it's not really about him. It's about the choice that every person watching this right now is making. Right now, today, with the gifts and intelligence and the time that you still have. Stay with this story until the end. Because what's waiting in the final chapters is not just a verdict on one man's life, it's a mirror. And mirrors, as you're about to discover, can be the most terrifying and the most liberating things in the world. Oh, and if this kind of story moves something in you, do yourself a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Because there's a lot more where this came from. There's a moment in life that no one warns you about. It doesn't come with a knock on the door, it doesn't send a message, it doesn't give you time to prepare. It just arrives. Like a cold wind that cuts through your chest before you even realize winter has come. And when it does, everything you thought was solid, your excuses, your justifications, your carefully built walls, crumbles like dust in the wind. That moment had finally come for him, and deep down, he'd always known it would. His name doesn't matter now. What matters is what he carried, the weight of 1,000 choices pressed against his shoulders like a mountain he'd spent a lifetime pretending wasn't there. He walked into that place slowly, each step heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was reminding him, you don't run from truth, truth always finds you. The room was simple. A bench, 2 seats, and a silence so loud it could swallow a man whole. He sat down, and for the first time in decades, he had nowhere to go. Across from him, there was a presence. Not the kind you see in movies. No fire, no thunder, no dramatic lights. Just stillness. A stillness that somehow knew everything. And that's what broke him first. Not words, not accusations, but the simple, unbearable act of being truly seen. We spend our whole lives building masks, don't we? Crafting versions of ourselves for every room we walk into. But in front of real truth, every mask falls. Every single one. And what's left underneath is just you. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable you. He thought about the last time someone had looked him in the eyes like that. Maybe it was his mother years ago, when he was still young enough to feel shame. Maybe it was a child on the street whose gaze he quickly avoided because, deep down, he knew. He knew. The soul has this terrifying ability to recognize its own guilt even before the mind admits it. Scientists call it cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension between who you believe you are and what you actually do. He'd been living inside that tension for so long it had become his normal. Until now. The bench was cold. Strange, how such a small detail sticks with you in moments like these. The coldness of a surface, the smell of the air, the sound of your own heartbeat suddenly too loud in your ears. He shifted uncomfortably, as if he could physically escape what was coming. But the judgment wasn't rushing. It never rushes. Truth is patient in a way that humans will never fully understand, because truth doesn't need time, it simply is. And it was waiting, with all the calm of an ocean that knows the storm always returns to shore. Outside, the world kept moving. Somewhere, people were laughing, making deals, shaking hands over things that felt important. Phones were ringing. Money was changing hands. Wars were being planned over dinner tables with crystal glasses and expensive wine. The machinery of human ambition, loud, relentless, proud. But in this room, none of that existed. In this room, the only currency was truth, and he was already deep in debt. The question wasn't whether he owed. The question was, how much? And then the voice came. Not loud. Not angry. Something far more terrifying than anger. Certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to raise its volume because it already knows the verdict. "Sit here," it said, "close to me. Let's talk." And in those simple words lived an entire lifetime of reckoning. He gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles pale, breath shallow, because somewhere inside him, beneath all the armor and all the gold and all the destruction, a small, forgotten part of him had always known this conversation was coming. The only question that remained now was whether he had the courage to look truth in the eyes, and not look away. Nobody becomes a monster overnight. That's the part that people don't like to hear, because it's so much more comfortable to believe that evil is born fully formed, that there's a clear line between the good ones and the bad ones, and that line could never run through you. But the truth, the uncomfortable, undeniable truth, is that every great destruction in human history started with a small choice. A tiny compromise. A whisper that said, "Just this once," and a soul that listened. His story was no different. It never is. He was born with gifts. Real ones. The kind that make teachers stop mid-sentence and take notice, the kind that make parents brag at dinner tables, the kind that open doors before you even knock. Intelligence isn't rare, but his level of it was sharp, precise, almost surgical in the way his mind cut through problems that left others paralyzed. He could have been anything. A healer. A builder. A voice for the voiceless. And for a brief, shining moment early in his life, that's exactly what he wanted to be. That version of him still existed somewhere, buried deep, but not yet gone. But somewhere along the way, the world made him an offer. It always does. Not with a dramatic handshake at a crossroads like in the old stories. No, it's far more subtle than that. It comes dressed as opportunity, as ambition, as, "You deserve more than this." And the dangerous thing about that voice is that it's not entirely wrong. He did have potential. He did deserve success. The problem wasn't the desire, it was the direction. Because at some point, without even noticing, he stopped asking, "How can I help?" and started asking, "How much can I get?" That single shift changed everything. Think about it in your own life for a second. Have you ever made a decision that felt small at the time, a shortcut, a half-truth, a moment where you chose comfort over conscience, and then looked back years later realizing that choice had quietly shaped everything that followed? That's how it works. Choices compound, just like interest in a bank account. The difference is that bad choices collect a debt that no bank can calculate. He'd been making deposits into that account for decades, and now the balance was due. Every robed judge, every silenced victim, every cold signature on a document that ended lives, all of it, compounding. His ganancia, his greed, didn't announce itself as greed. It arrived wearing the respectable suit of strategy, of efficiency, of, "This is just how the world works." He surrounded himself with people who confirmed his choices, who applauded his decisions, who never once dared to hold up a mirror. Because powerful men rarely keep mirrors nearby. Mirrors have a nasty habit of showing you what you actually look like. And so the destruction crept forward, year by year, deal by deal, life by life, while he slept soundly in beds that cost more than most people's yearly salary. Comfortable. Certain. Completely blind. The hardest part of his story, the part that should shake you to your core, is that he wasn't unique. He was a pattern. A template that has repeated itself throughout all of human history, wearing different faces, different flags, different titles. The pharaohs had it. The emperors had it. The industrial tycoons, the corrupt politicians, the arms dealers signing contracts over golf courses, they all shared the same fundamental architecture of self-deception. The belief that their intelligence, their power, their wealth somehow exempted them from the basic rules of humanity. That the judgmento, the reckoning, was for other people. Smaller people. Not for them. And yet, here he was, sitting on that cold bench, replaying the movie of his choices in high definition, unable to fast forward, unable to skip the uncomfortable scenes. Every face he'd hurt floated back to him now with terrifying clarity, not as abstract numbers or collateral damage, but as real people with real eyes and real pain. The weight of it was almost physical, because that's what truth does when it finally catches up to you. It makes the invisible visible, it makes the forgotten unforgettable, And it reminds you that behind every choice, there was always a human being on the other end. Always. And those human beings, they were about to have their say. There's a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't get talked about enough, the tragedy of wasted potential. Not the potential of someone who never had a chance, but the potential of someone who had every chance in the world and chose to burn it. We mourn the genius who died young, the artist silenced too soon, the leader taken before their time. But we rarely stop to grieve the man who lived long, lived well, lived loud, and spent every single day of that long life dismantling the very gifts he was given. That was him. And that grief was heavier than any grave. His hands were extraordinary, literally and metaphorically. From the time he was a young man, those hands could solve what others couldn't touch. He understood systems, biological, mechanical, political, in a way that felt almost supernatural. Doctors twice his age would pause to hear his theories. Engineers would sketch out problems and he'd find the solution before they finished drawing. He had what few people ever develop: the ability to see how things connect, how one variable shifts an entire ecosystem, how a single intervention could change thousands of lives. His hands were built to heal, built to fix, built to save. But healing is slow work, humble work. It doesn't come with applause on the first day, or the second, or sometimes even the 100th. Healing requires patience, and patience was the one virtue his ambition refused to cultivate. So when the opportunity came to use that same brilliant mind for something faster, louder, more profitable, he didn't hesitate long. The transition was smooth, almost elegant in its logic. If he understood how systems worked, he could also understand how to weaponize them. And the world, as it turned out, paid extraordinarily well for weaponized intelligence. Far better than it paid for healing. Here's an analogy that might hit close to home. Imagine a master chef, someone with a God-given ability to nourish, to bring people together around a table, to turn simple ingredients into something that makes strangers feel like family. Now imagine that same chef using their knowledge of flavors and chemistry not to feed, but to poison. Same hands, same knowledge, completely opposite intention. That's what happened here. The gift didn't change, only the direction it was pointed. And direction, as any physicist will tell you, changes everything about what a force actually does in the world. He pointed his gift at destruction, and destruction is exactly what he got. The infirmos, the sick, the suffering, the ones who needed exactly what he could have offered, they never knew his name. They never knew that somewhere in the world, a man with the precise intelligence to find their cure had decided their lives weren't profitable enough to prioritize. That's the silent crime that history rarely prosecutes. Not just what people do, but what they don't do with what they were given. Every medicine not developed, every treatment not pursued, every suffering not addressed because the math didn't work out, that's not neutral. That's a choice. And choices, as we've already established, always compound. What replaced the healing was terrifying in its sophistication. He didn't build crude weapons. No, that would have been beneath his intelligence. He built elegant destruction. Systems so advanced, so precise in their lethality, that other powerful men marveled at the engineering even as they planned how to use it against each other's children. And he stood in glass towers watching presentations of his work with the calm satisfaction of a craftsman admiring a finished piece. The guerra, the war that his creations would eventually fuel, was still abstract to him then. Numbers on a screen, projected casualties in a spreadsheet, acceptable losses in a strategy document. Clean, distant, manageable. But sitting on that bench now, none of it was distant anymore. Every statistic had a face. Every projected casualty had a mother. Every acceptable loss had been a child who would never grow up, a teacher who would never finish their lesson, a doctor who would never heal another patient, because someone else's brilliant hands had decided their destruction was worth more than their survival. The weight of that realization didn't arrive gently. It crashed into him like a wave he'd spent a lifetime building walls to avoid. And the cruelest part, the walls he'd built were made from the same intelligence that could have, should have, would have saved them. The very hands that destroyed were the hands meant to heal. And that irony, that devastating irony, was only the beginning of what truth had prepared for him. There's something deeply human about the way we distance ourselves from the consequences of our actions. We build language for it, collateral damage, strategic necessity, the cost of progress, as if wrapping destruction in sophisticated vocabulary somehow reduces its weight. As if the words we choose to describe suffering can change the reality of the person experiencing it. He was a master of this particular art. He could sit in a boardroom and discuss the projected impact of his weapon systems with the same detached calm that a meteorologist discusses tomorrow's weather forecast. Clinical. Professional. Completely disconnected from the storm he was describing. But war has a way of making itself real, whether you're ready for it or not. The first time he saw footage, real footage, not sanitized news coverage but raw, unfiltered reality, something cracked inside him. Not enough to stop. Not enough to change course. But enough to leave a mark. A child's shoe in the rubble of what used to be a school. A woman's hands reaching into debris that used to be her home. An old man sitting in the middle of a destroyed street, not crying, not screaming, just sitting, with the hollow eyes of someone whose world has been so completely erased that even grief requires an energy he no longer possessed. He saw it. He registered it. And then he looked away. Looking away is its own kind of violence. We don't talk about that enough. The active choice to unsee, to unfeel, to intellectually process human suffering and then file it away in a mental cabinet labeled, "Not my direct responsibility." That choice has consequences just as real as pulling a trigger. He became extraordinarily skilled at this particular form of self-preservation. Every morning he'd open his eyes in his enormous bed, in his climate-controlled room, in his secured compound, and consciously, deliberately, choose to focus on everything except the guerra raging on the other side of the world that his hands had armed. It was almost impressive, the discipline required to maintain that level of willful blindness. Imagine you hand someone a match. You know there's dry wood nearby. You know the wind is blowing. You hand them the match anyway, walk away, and then act surprised when you see the smoke rising on the horizon. That's not innocence, that's theater. And he'd been performing that theater for decades, collecting his fees, accepting his awards, giving speeches about innovation and progress while the fires he'd lit consumed entire generations. The destroyco, the destruction, wasn't an accident or an unintended side effect. It was the product. Packaged, sold, and delivered with ruthless efficiency to whoever could afford the invoice. The children were what haunted him most in that room, on that bench. Not the soldiers. Soldiers make choices, carry arms, enter the battlefield with some understanding of the risk. But the children. The ones playing in courtyards when the sky changed. The ones sleeping when the walls came down. The ones who never had the chance to choose anything because someone else's choices had already written their ending. His aviao, the technology born from his genius, had cast shadows over playgrounds. Had turned birthday mornings into final mornings. And those children, those faces he'd never met, were somehow all present in that room with him now. Not as ghosts. As witnesses. History books tend to name the generals, the politicians, the presidents who declare wars. They rarely name the architects behind the architecture of destruction, the men in suits who built the machines, signed the contracts, optimized the lethality. He had lived comfortably in that anonymity for years. While others faced tribunals and cameras and public accountability, he operated in the elegant shadows of private sector innovation. But truth doesn't read history books written by the victors. Truth has its own archive, complete, unedited, with no chapters conveniently omitted. And in that archive, his name was written next to every cidade reduced to rubble, every family photo buried under concrete, every future that never got the chance to begin. The Terra, the land of his own ancestors, had not been spared either. That was perhaps the detail that carried the sharpest irony. In his relentless pursuit of power and profit, he had armed conflicts that eventually circled back, consuming the very ground his grandparents had walked, the same soil that had grown the food of his childhood, the same rivers his mother had pointed to with pride. Destruction, it turns out, is spectacularly bad at respecting boundaries, geographic, generational, or otherwise. What you send out into the world has a way of finding its way home. Always. And as he sat there, breathing the heavy air of that unavoidable room, the sounds of those distant wars were no longer distant at all. They were right there, in his chest, asking the only question that had ever mattered: what did you do with what you were given? The answer was coming, and it would spare nothing. There's a difference between knowing something and facing it. You can know, on an intellectual level, that fire burns, But it's only when your hand gets close enough to feel the heat that knowledge becomes real. He had always known, somewhere in the deep architecture of his conscience, that what he was doing was wrong. The soul doesn't lie to itself as successfully as the mind does. But knowing and facing are two completely different acts of courage, and facing had always been the one thing his extraordinary intelligence had helped him avoid. Until now. Until this room. Until this bench and this silence and this presence that offered absolutely nowhere to hide. The mirror that truth held up wasn't made of glass. It was made of memory. Sharp, high-definition, chronologically perfect memory that replayed every scene he'd spent decades editing out of his personal narrative. And unlike the story he'd told himself, the one where he was the visionary, the innovator, the necessary force of progress, this version had no flattering angles. No carefully chosen lighting. No sympathetic narrator smoothing over the uncomfortable parts. Just raw, unfiltered reality, scene by scene, choice by choice, consequence by consequence. Watching yourself as you actually were, not as you wished to be remembered, is perhaps the most violent experience a human soul can endure. We all do a version of this, don't we? We curate our own stories. We remember our intentions more clearly than our impacts. We file away the moments that contradict our self-image and amplify the ones that confirm it. Psychologists call it self-serving bias, the very human tendency to interpret events in ways that protect our ego and preserve our sense of being fundamentally good people. He'd weaponized this tendency the same way he'd weaponized everything else, with precision and without mercy. But in front of real verdade, self-serving bias simply dissolves. There's no arguing with a mirror that shows you everything. What he saw first surprised him, not because it was shocking, but because it was small. The very first scene wasn't a war room or a boardroom or a weapons test. It was a young man at a crossroads, barely 30, holding two letters. One was an offer to lead a medical research team working on treatments for diseases that devastated the poorest communities on Earth. The other was a contract with a defense corporation, 3 times the salary, prestigious title, immediate power. He remembered that moment. He remembered the weight of both envelopes. And he remembered, with devastating clarity, how quickly he'd made his choice. How easily the culpa had been rationalized away. How smoothly the first brick of his destruction had been laid. The mirror kept showing. Scene after scene. Each one a node in the network of his choices, each one connected to the next with the terrible logic of cause and effect. A signature here that funded a coup there. A meeting there that produced a weapon here. A handshake that sealed a deal that armed a faction that destroyed a village, that created refugees, that filled camps, that broke families, that produced a generation of children who grew up knowing only war. The chain was so long, so intricate, so devastatingly complete that even he, the man who'd built it, couldn't fully trace every link. But truth could. Truth followed every single thread to its end. The hardest scene wasn't the most dramatic one. It wasn't the footage of destruction, or the maps of conflict zones, or the financial records of his empire. The hardest scene was quieter. A woman, middle-aged, unremarkable in the way that real people are unremarkable, the kind of person who never makes the news, sitting at a kitchen table in a country he'd never visited, looking at a photograph of her son. Her son who had died at 22 in a conflict fueled by weapons bearing the invisible fingerprint of his genius. She wasn't crying in the scene. She was just looking. With the particular stillness of someone who has cried so much that the tears have run dry but the grief has nowhere else to go. He couldn't look away from her. For the first time in decades, he couldn't look away. And that was the moment the arrepentimiento arrived, not as a dramatic breakdown, not as a theatrical confession, but as a quiet, devastating understanding that settled into his bones like cold water. Regret, real regret, doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between one breath and the next, in the sudden, unbearable awareness of the distance between who you were capable of being and who you actually chose to be. He sat with that understanding for what felt like eternity, while the mirror continued its patient, merciless, necessary work. Because truth doesn't rush the reckoning. It simply shows you everything, and waits for you to stop running from what you see. Gold is heavy. Not just physically, though it is remarkably dense for its size, but in the way it settles into a life. The way it changes what you see when you look at people, what you hear when they speak, what you trust about their motives. He had accumulated enough of it to understand, better than most, That wealth beyond a certain point stops being a resource and starts being a lens that distorts everything it touches, including the man holding it. He'd watched it happen to others and told himself he was different. He wasn't different. Nobody ever is. Money had been his most reliable tool for avoiding consequences. Long before that bench, long before that room, he'd learned that in the world he operated in, the right amount of auro could make almost anything disappear. Investigations, testimonies, inconvenient journalists, troublesome regulations. He hadn't invented corruption. Corruption is embarrassingly ancient, but he had refined it to an art form, deploying his wealth with the same surgical precision he applied to everything else. Why argue when you can buy? Why defend when you can silence? Why change when you can simply pay for the privilege of staying exactly who you are? Here's what they don't tell you about buying your way out of accountability. It works. For a long time, it works spectacularly well. And that's precisely what makes it so dangerous. Not that it fails immediately, but that it succeeds long enough for you to completely forget that there's any other way. He had been so insulated by his wealth, so perfectly cushioned from the natural consequences of his actions, that somewhere along the way he'd made the most catastrophic error available to a powerful man. He began to believe his own immunity was permanent. That the rules which governed other people simply didn't apply to him. That he had, through sheer accumulation, purchased his way out of the human condition itself. Think about what that does to a person's soul. Imagine never hearing no. Imagine every desire immediately satisfied, every obstacle immediately removed, every critic immediately neutralized. Imagine living for decades in an environment so perfectly engineered to confirm your importance that you genuinely begin to lose the ability to perceive your own limitations. It's not just arrogance, it's something deeper, more architectural. It's the complete erosion of the internal feedback system that keeps human beings connected to reality. His ganancia had done exactly that, hollowed him out from the inside while filling his external world with everything money could buy. The poder, the power, had been the most addictive part. Not the money itself, but what the money represented, the ability to make the world bend to his will. To pick up a phone and change the course of events in countries he'd never visited. To sit in a room with heads of state and understand, with quiet certainty, that he had more actual influence over their decisions than their own citizens did. That kind of power rewires the brain in ways that neuroscience is only beginning to understand. It creates a feedback loop so intense, so continuously reinforcing, that walking away becomes neurologically comparable to withdrawal. He hadn't been able to stop. He hadn't wanted to stop. Until now there had been nothing capable of making him stop. But in that room, on that bench, the gold meant nothing. Less than nothing, it was evidence. Every acquisition, every transaction, every empire-building maneuver that he'd been so proud of was laid out not as achievement but as testimony. The mansos, the accounts in countries chosen specifically for their discretion, the art collections, the private islands, none of it spoke of success in that room. It spoke of the distance he'd been willing to travel from his own humanity in pursuit of more. Always more. The mandamentos, the fundamental laws he'd been taught as a child, the simple, ancient instructions for how to live as a decent human being. He'd stepped over every single one of them so many times they were no longer even visible beneath his feet. And now the accounting was happening, and it was the one accounting his gold could not touch. Because the judge in that room had no price. Had never had a price. Would never have a price. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life operating on the foundational assumption that everything and everyone could be bought, that single fact, the existence of something genuinely, permanently beyond his purchasing power, was more destabilizing than anything he'd ever encountered. His wealth, his greatest tool, his most trusted weapon, sat completely inert in that room. Useless. Decorative. Embarrassing, even. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was completely, utterly, magnificently broke. Silence, real silence, is one of the rarest and most terrifying experiences available to a human being. We fill our lives with noise, deliberately, compulsively, sometimes desperately, because silence has this inconvenient habit of allowing things to surface that we'd much rather keep submerged. He had been particularly skilled at noise. His life had been an uninterrupted symphony of meetings, calls, negotiations, announcements, celebrations, crises, and countermeasures, a relentless soundtrack engineered, whether consciously or not, to ensure that the quieter voice inside him never got loud enough to be heard. But now the music had stopped. And the silence was absolute. The Julgamento didn't arrive with theatrics. No booming proclamation, no dramatic reading of charges, no audience in gallery seats. Just that presence, that certainty, and the complete and total record of a life laid open like a book that had been written in real time and was now, finally, being read by its author for the first time without the comfort of selective memory. Each page was precise. Each entry accurate. And what struck him most profoundly wasn't the magnitude of the worst moments, it was the consistency of the pattern. How many times, in how many different circumstances, he had faced the same fundamental choice between conscience and convenience, and chosen convenience. Every single time. There's a concept in philosophy called moral luck, the idea that much of what we're praised or blamed for depends on circumstances outside our control. He had tried this argument on himself many times over the years. The system was already corrupt when I arrived. Others would have done worse. I created jobs. I funded research. I gave to charity. The mental gymnastics required to maintain a positive self-image while doing genuinely harmful things is extraordinary, and he had been an Olympic-level performer. But in front of this particular tribunal, moral luck was not a recognized defense. The record was the record. The choices were the choices. The consequences were the consequences. What does it feel like to be truly, completely, inescapably accountable? Not the performative accountability of a press conference apology, not the managed accountability of a legal settlement, not the curated accountability of a memoir written with a sympathetic ghostwriter, but real accountability, the kind where there's no spin, no framing, no narrative management possible? He was finding out. And the answer, if his face was any indication, was that it felt like every wall you'd ever built collapsing simultaneously, leaving you standing in the open with nothing between you and the full weight of every truth you'd ever avoided. Exposed. Completely. Irrevocably. The faces came back again during the silence. Not as accusers, that would have been easier to bear, easier to argue against. They came back simply as themselves. The woman with the photograph. The child's shoe in the rubble. The old man in the destroyed street. The researchers who could have had his funding. The patients who could have had his cures. The soldiers who could have come home if his weapons had never existed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their mere presence, their simple, undeniable reality, was the most complete indictment ever assembled. The silencio between him and them was so full of meaning it had physical weight. And then came the question he'd been dreading since the moment he sat down. Not an accusation, not a condemnation, but a question. Simple, direct, unanswerable in the way that only the most essential questions are unanswerable. What did you do with what I gave you? 4 seconds of silence followed, during which entire civilizations could have risen and fallen. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Because what do you say? What possible arrangement of words addresses that question honestly without simultaneously destroying every carefully maintained illusion about who you were? There were no words. There had never been words for this moment. Only truth. And truth, he was learning, rarely needs words to make itself understood. The sentence, when it came, wasn't announced. It was recognized, by him, in the silence, before it was ever spoken aloud. Because deep down, beneath all the armor and gold and noise and justification, he'd always known what a life like his deserved. The recognition arrived not with anger or despair, but with something far more complex, a terrible, clarifying, almost merciful understanding. This was the consequence he'd been building toward his entire life, one choice at a time. He hadn't been ambushed by justice. He had constructed it, brick by careful brick, with his own extraordinary hands. And the only thing left now, the only thing that had ever really been left, was to face what those hands had built. Fully. Finally. Without looking away. After every storm, there's a moment of extraordinary stillness. Not peace, exactly, something more complicated than peace. A kind of suspended clarity where the air feels different, where everything that was hidden under the noise and movement of the storm is suddenly, starkly visible. He sat in that stillness now, on the other side of everything, the accounting complete, the record closed, the sentence understood, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what he could acquire, control, or avoid. He was thinking about what remained. What, if anything, of value had survived the wreckage of a life so brilliantly, so catastrophically misused. Legacy is a word that powerful people think about obsessively, usually in terms of buildings with their names on them, foundations established in their honor, chapters in history books that future generations will read with admiration. He had planned his legacy meticulously, the way he planned everything, with resources, with strategy, with a careful management of narrative. But legacy, real legacy, isn't what you build with money or what you commission historians to write. It's what remains in the lives of the people your choices touched. And in that room, his real legacy was unmistakable, not in marble and steel, but in absences. In the things that no longer existed because of him. But here's what's remarkable about truth, and this might be the most important thing said in this entire story. It doesn't only reveal destruction. It also reveals possibility. Because the same mirror that showed him everything he'd destroyed also showed him something else, something smaller but somehow more luminous, the moments where he'd almost chosen differently. The split seconds where conscience had flickered, where something human had surfaced briefly before being submerged again by ambition. Those moments hadn't been enough. They hadn't changed anything. But they had existed. And their existence meant something, even now. Even here. Even at the end. The arrepentimiento that had settled into his bones during the mirror's work had done something unexpected. It had reconnected him, for the first time in decades, to the young man who'd held those two envelopes. The one who'd still had a choice. And while that connection couldn't undo a single consequence, couldn't restore a single life, couldn't rebuild a single city, it did something quieter and more profound. It reminded him what he had actually been. Not a monster born fully formed, not an inevitable product of circumstance, but a human being who had made choices. Which meant that somewhere, in the world he was leaving behind, other human beings were making those same choices right now. At this very moment. Holding their own envelopes. That's the gift buried inside the darkest stories, if you're willing to dig for it. Every tale of destruction is simultaneously a map of the decisions that led there, which means it's also a guide to the decisions that don't lead there. His story wasn't just his. It was a mirror for everyone who has ever stood at a crossroads between conscience and convenience, between healing and harm, between the gift they were given and the use they chose for it. The humanidade, all of us, collectively, carries this story in our DNA. We have been the destroyers. We have been the destroyed. And we have been, in our better moments, the healers. The question is always which one we choose to be tomorrow. What remains, when everything else is stripped away, is always simpler than we expect. Not the empires. Not the accounts. Not the awards or the titles or the square footage of the properties. What remains is the answer to one question, asked in a quiet room by a presence that cannot be bought, bargained with, or deceived. Did you love well? Not perfectly. Perfection was never the standard. But did you use what you were given in service of something beyond yourself? Did you, in the moments that counted, choose the harder, truer, more human path? His answer was written in the record that had just been read. But your answer, the answer of every person hearing this story right now, is still being written. Every single day. In every single choice. And maybe that's the real reason stories like his need to be told. Not to condemn, not to terrify, not to point fingers from a safe distance at a villain conveniently different from ourselves, but to hold up the same mirror that truth held up to him and ask, gently but seriously, what are you building with what you were given? The aviao of your life, the vehicle of your unique intelligence, your specific gifts, your particular position in the world, where is it flying? Toward healing or toward harm? Toward connection or toward destruction? Toward the version of you that the best part of you always knew you could be? The bench is always there. Truth is always patient. And the conversation, the real conversation, is always waiting for the moment you're ready to sit down and have it. He closed his eyes on that bench, finally. Not in defeat, in something closer to surrender, which is different. Defeat is when you stop fighting because you've lost. Surrender is when you stop fighting because you finally understand what you were fighting against was the only thing that could have saved you. In the stillness that followed, in that extraordinary silence on the other side of everything, something shifted. Something small, fragile, improbably persistent, like the first green shoot pushing through concrete after a long winter. It wouldn't undo what had been done. Nothing could undo what had been done. But it was real. And in a story this dark, anything real and living is worth paying attention to. Because it means that even here, even now, even after all of this, something remains. And so here we are, on the other side of one man's entire life, laid out, examined, and finally, honestly faced. But before you go, I need to ask you something. And I want you to actually think about it, not just scroll past. If you were sitting on that bench today, not as a punishment, but as an honest audit, what would the mirror show? Not your worst moments, not your best, but the pattern. The direction your choices have been pointing. The use you've been making of whatever gifts, whatever intelligence, whatever specific, irreplaceable combination of abilities you were given. It's a question worth sitting with. Maybe even worth losing some sleep over. Now, this story was born from a song. A single piece of music that carried enough truth in its verses to fill an entire lifetime. And that makes me wonder, what song carries your story? What music, when you close your eyes and really listen, feels like it was written about something you've lived, something you felt, something you've been through that words alone could never quite capture? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, tell me the song, and tell me why. Because your story deserves to be told too. And the next history-altering, soul-stirring, never-seen-before story we build together might just start with the music you choose. If you're not subscribed yet, fix that right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we're just getting started, and you do not want to miss what's coming next.